Welcome to the Refurbishment Mastery podcast with me, Martin Rapley. If you're a property investor who is worried about paying too much for your next property, concerned that you don't know how to manage a refurb, or scared that you will be ripped off by a builder, then this is for you. In this podcast, I share over 30 years of experience of managing refurbishments and conversions to help you make more profit, save your time, and ultimately enjoy the process. On with the podcast. In this episode, I'm going to answer another frequently asked question from members of my community, which is, should I pay my builder money before they actually start the work? And as I say, amongst those questions that come up frequently, this is definitely another one that's right up there high on the list. And really, I think the answer to this is we need to consider on what basis we're paying the builder up front. Are we paying a holding deposit, which as a result may be relatively small as far as the sum goes, or is the builder actually asking for a significant amount of money in advance to allow them to get started? So let's talk about the deposit option first. If a builder is particularly busy, then it may well be that they want to have some certainty that the work that you're appointing them to do is actually going to proceed. And they may say, I can book you in to start, at this particular date, but because I'm going to book you in and I'm going to turn away other work as a result, I'd like to take a deposit from you such that ultimately, if you do change your mind, they've got some kind of recompense, and there's an element of, shall we call it, hurt money on your side that you would lose if you change your mind about that particular project going ahead. Now, if we talk about a deposit, then from that kind of perspective, the question really is, how much should a deposit be? And in reality, a holding deposit that secures some time in the diary of your particular chosen builder probably isn't a great deal of money. Perhaps £1,000, maybe £2,000, and certainly, per se, I would be cautious of a holding deposit that goes over £5,000, which might be what it is for a slightly, for a more significant size project, but by and large, it wants to be a few £1,000s. So that's one reason you may pay a builder in advance as a holding deposit to get the slots into the diary. Now, the other reason you're going to be asked for payment in advance is primarily because contractors want to, or they claim that they need to buy some materials, and they claim that they've got costs in advance and it's really expensive to start the project, etc., etc. Now, there could be a reason that they're saying that because your payment terms are actually quite onerous. So you may have said to them, well, the payment terms are, you've got to do 4 weeks worth of work, and then I'm going to pay you within 14 days of that valuation. In which case, they could potentially be at your particular property for 6 weeks before they receive any funds from you. And particularly if you invoke those kinds of terms on relatively small contractors, they are going to have cash flow problems as a result of that. And so they're going to potentially ask for funds in advance just to get them going, and possibly have cash flow problems all the way through the project, depending on how you structure that. So on very small projects, very, very small projects, I would pay monthly. I'd pay weekly. A lot of my projects I actually value every 2 weeks, and I agree to pay within about 72 hours or so. Invariably, I pay quicker than 72 hours anyway, but it's always worth having, at least agree in a slightly longer period, just in case something happens at that particular time. Whereas if you've got funds being given to you or lent to you by a commercial investor, a bank or a finance house of some description, they're almost certainly going to be expecting monthly valuations and payments within 14 days. So this is one of the reasons that you need to be aware of the contractors you're talking to. You need to be upfront with the contractors about the terms of the payments. And perhaps you need to be flexible as well. So if you are deploying your own funds, if you have the cash in the bank ready to go effectively, then perhaps you can be a little bit more flexible than if you're using funds from a commercial lender where you're pretty much tied into their into their payment regime, whatever the terms of their loan actually are. So it could be that rather than paying money in advance, you actually need to find a different contractor in that circumstance. And it could be that you've actually found a contractor that's possibly a little bit too small for the project, and you need to find a contractor that's a little bit bigger. Now, of course, that is going to reflect back in the costings because bigger contractors have often got a little bit more management cost, a little bit more overhead cost, and that it obviously all just gets factored into the costing. But as a result, you may not need to pay any funds in advance. And then you're going to have other contractors that are asking for funds in advance because they haven't got any money. They can't actually even afford a week's worth of work and pay their tradesmen at the end of the week, because they just do not. Yeah, they're pretty much hand to mouth. They do not have any money to any money to spare, any cash in the bank. And they'll tell you that they need to buy materials. They may need to pay for a few things in the first week, and that is perhaps leads to the next kind of contractor, which is the contractor that has actually got serious cash flow issues and potentially won't even make it to the end of your project before ceasing to trade, and may even unfortunately get to a point where they persuade you to pay more than you should do, and then they just disappear completely. And they're obviously the contractors we want to completely avoid. So any contractor that's asking for funds in advance for anything more than what might be a holding deposit, you really need to consider whether that is the right contractor to proceed with. As I say, they may be too small for the project. They may have cash flow issues, and in the real extreme, they may even end up getting to a point where ultimately, and unfortunately this does happen, they almost set out to rip you off in the first place because it's the only way they know how to operate, and they're as I say, they're clearly the contractors you want to keep away from. So do some due diligence, do some research, and some ways around this is to be upfront with the builders about the payment terms that you've got. If Tell the contractors, particularly if you've got more onerous payment terms for some reason, tell them up front, potentially before they even price the project. Some contractors will say to you they can't operate on those terms, and you do better not working with the contractors this time around and going to find the contractors that can work on those terms. Other contractors will just give you a lot of story as things go on as to why they need a deposit. By the way, a contractor who says they need money or they need payment for materials in advance, you need to try and find out what that's all about, because ultimately, in the first week of a project, they're going to do probably some stripping out and they're going to fill some skips up. Now, in the first week, they're probably, unless they're really organized and they've got a big team, they're going to struggle to fill more than 3 skips. And even if they've got to pay for the skips in advance, that probably isn't £1,000. And in theory, you would expect any contractor to have cash flow or cash in the bank to pay the tradesman for that first week. But maybe you can even agree to do the first valuation at the end of the first week, just to kind of remove that risk associated with making a payment in advance. I would think any bona fide contractor has actually got or should have cash in the bank, and they should have credit terms with a number of suppliers. Not necessarily all of them, and I know for sure that some waste collection companies won't give credit terms to some of the smaller contractors, but certainly, yeah, they don't need. They should be able to get credit terms for day-to-day materials. Now, so if we think that we're going to perhaps do 2 weeks on site, the first week is stripping out. So we've got some men stripping things out and we've got some skips. The second week, they may well start to do some basic partitions, perhaps some basic work to the services, depending on your kind of project. There's no really expensive materials needed in the second week either. Timber, in the grand scheme of things, for building partitions is not that expensive, obviously depending on the size of your project, but you'd struggle to spend £500 on timber for building partitions, for the first week, unless they're really going to motor on with plasterboard and insulation and things like that. And of course, if they're doing some electric works and plumbing work, yes, the materials for those are going to be a little bit higher, perhaps 1,000 or two, depending again what you're going to do. But a lot of those tradesmen, a lot of those are contractors in their own right, and often they won't be charging the builder straight away. And bearing in mind they've perhaps started in week 2 anyway, if they are going to charge anything, it will be at the end of week 2, at which point you can perhaps have already agreed that that's the time for the first valuation and therefore first payment. So be very careful of builders that say that they need funds in advance to buy materials. Unfortunately, when they say they need funds in advance to buy materials, it's not uncommon that those funds actually go into the pot to buy materials for the project that they haven't yet finished, because they've got themselves in cash flow problems. They haven't finished the previous project. Your deposit goes towards buying those materials, which of course is not really where you need it to be going. And ultimately, they can't finish your project until someone else has paid them a deposit in 8 weeks' time or so, when yours is getting near the end, for their next project. And if they can't get that for some reason, then ultimately they haven't got the funds to finish your project, and now it's you that suffers. So yeah, hopefully you can see where I'm coming from here, is that much more than a holding deposit, and really you need to be super cautious about what that deposit is all about and what that payment in advance is all about. Now, within the formal JCT forms of contract, the Joint Contracts Tribunal, which is the place I always go to if I ever want to kind of answer any question that's got a contractual implication, the first thing I'll always do is look, although in most cases I already know, but I'll always go to what is in the JCT form of contract, because the JCT, the Joint Contracts Tribunal, have dealt with these questions in the past, and have got a provision within their contracts. They haven't got the provisions are not brilliant, but there is a provision in there, and it doesn't actually say what happens with the money, but it does allow for what they call advanced payments. And you can actually put into the contracts that there is an advance payment, whatever that amount is. And then the second thing that you also put into the contract is the mechanism for repaying that advanced payment. Is it coming out the whole of the first period's worth of valuation? So if you've paid £1,000 holding deposit, does that come off the first, shall we say, 2 weeks worth of work, and the whole lot comes back again? Sometimes I've had deposits that are repaid on a milestone. I've had to pay a deposit because we need the contractor to buy some specific bespoke products. Things like that can be windows, bifolding doors, sometimes specialist kitchens and things like that. Sometimes some specialist plant has been needed to be purchased. So the repayment of that fund is actually on the milestone of those goods being delivered to site, say. Or the repayment of the fund could be split in an even way over the period of the week. So the period of the project. So let's say the amount you agree is £2,000, and you agree it's a 10-week project, so £200 gets reimbursed every week, comes off the valuation every single week. Or maybe you agree it as a percentage of the value of the work. So we say how much of the work has been completed as a percentage of the total value of the project, and we return that amount of the deposit. All of those are bona fide and safe ways of dealing with the deposit, the advance payment. But it's really important that you agree up front with the builder, because the builder will be wanting to stretch that as long as possible, and that may not be right for you. So do make sure that you agree with the builder the mechanism for returning these advance payments. And as I say, under the JCT forms of contract, there is nothing wrong with advance payments, and it doesn't actually talk about size or what we call them. They just call them advance payments. So if you can keep them down to a minimum, keep them down to a deposit, that is no bad thing. Now, I was talking about this very subject at a property meeting a number of years ago now. Someone had asked me the question, very much the question that I'm discussing here. And there was a builder in the room who came and spoke to me at the end of the evening, and he said, um, everything you've said is exactly right. He said, he said, the good builders should only be asking for a deposit. He said, I don't always take a deposit or anything. He said, but one of the things he'd established was that if you asked for a deposit, or you asked for a commitment fee, or you asked for funds in advance, he found that 50% of the time there was no discussion about it, and his clients paid him. So he always asked for it. What he was saying was, because he thought and he knew that in a lot of cases, or 50% of the cases, he could actually get the money in advance, he actually asked for it every single time. And he said, depending on how he felt with the people he was working for, would depend whether it was a few £1,000 or even, £10,000 or more. But he also said that he was always prepared to back down to zero if anyone discussed it with him, contested it with him, and he really wanted the project. So the learning here, guys, is if you've got a builder that's asking for payments in advance, the first thing is challenge it, because that builder actually said if it was challenged with him, he would always back down. When I had my own construction company, I never ever asked for payments in advance. I always took my clients on trust. Ultimately, I knew where they lived, I knew their property, I knew their business. A lot of the time I was doing this, builders were, my clients were property investors outside of businesses, because back in those days, most property investors didn't have businesses. But you've got a business now, and so that's traceable. That's on company's house. It's not easy to run away and not pay the builder. And a lot of builders are well aware of that, and so won't necessarily ask for a payment in advance. Ultimately, if you're making a payment in advance, you need to be aware that it isn't an amount greater than an amount that you're prepared to lose. So if you do pay the builder in advance, under whatever pretext it is, you need to be in a position where you're happy that if that builder, in the worst case scenario, goes bankrupt and disappears, you haven't lost kind of life-changing money. So for me, it's perhaps £1,000, £2,000. Now, look at it from the other side. All of the time I have been a property investor, I personally have never ever paid builders in advance. I've always selected builders that are prepared not to ask payment in advance, and I've always built a relationship with the builders that I am working with to ensure that ultimately they trust me, and in return I trust them. And I think this is a key thing. If you can demonstrate your credibility to builders by having a well planned out scheme, a well thought through scheme with quality documentation, and you follow through a quality process of getting prices from builders and asking good questions and coming across to the builders as being credible, I suspect a lot of them won't ask for a deposit. They certainly won't ask for sizable amounts up front, and therefore, your risk is massively reduced. I'm reminded of another story of a client who actually had been in a training course that I was running. This conversation came up again. And about 2 weeks later on Facebook, this particular person, I'm not going to say male or female, this particular person posted that their builder had disappeared with £50,000 they'd paid. Effectively, the builder had quoted somewhere in the region of £150,000 for doing a project, so a sizable project. They'd asked for a third of it in advance. This particular person had paid a third of it in advance, and then the builder had disappeared. And this particular person was posting on Facebook asking if anyone could help them track down where this particular builder had gone to and disappeared with their money. It was really interesting. The first comment on this particular Facebook post was, which bit of the training course you did with Martin 3 weeks ago did you fall asleep during? Because he discussed this extensively at the time. And ultimately, for me, and certainly for this particular investor, £50,000 is life-changing money. We don't want to be losing that. So we want to be keeping our payments in advance down to a minimum, possibly no more than a few £1,000s as a deposit. And certainly being cautious of anything more than that, because so often that is the start of the clues that perhaps this is not actually the builder that you want to be working with. And really, in summary, and you've heard me say this before, we want to be looking to work with the good builders, the right builders. We want to be looking for clues that builders we're talking to are not the good builders and not the right builders. And ultimately, advance payments, certainly anything more than a deposit, is another clue that this may not be the right builder for you to work with. So use all of this as part of your decision-making process to ensure that you do actually engage the right builders. And if you don't ask, you don't get. If you ask for a deposit and advance payment to be taken off, who knows? You may well get to a point where you don't need to pay anything in advance. And of course, that is reducing the risk to you in the longer term. So good luck with those conversations with your builders. And hopefully just listening to this particular episode has helped you, frame the discussion, understand things with your builder a little bit better, and massively reduced your potential risk.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. Please do like, share, and leave a comment where you can. If you need any guidance or advice with anything to do with your refurbishments or conversions, then don't hesitate to reach out. You can book a free call with me by clicking on the link at the top of my website, refurbishmentmastery.com. There's other ways you can contact me in the show notes as well. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.